All right. I do have a little intro, so here we go.
Mission First Tactical is the official tactical accessories provider for the Talking Lead podcast and the Leadhead Brigade. Use the code LEADHEAD for an exclusive 20% discount on all orders.
All right, lead heads. Welcome back to another episode of the Talking Lead podcast, where we have been leducating the uneducated for 12 years now, since 2012. And we've got a great lineup for you today. But before we get into that, if you didn't get an opportunity, make sure you go back to our previous episode. That is where we did our recap of the Gun Owners of America goals, their first convention. They had it in Knoxville, Tennessee, which is about 2 hours away from where I'm at. So, of course, I had to hop up there and check it out. And an awesome range day and a full 2-3 days of events there at the goals. And that is where Ton and I, with Firebird Targets, announced the giveaway. We had these special coins made up, challenge coins made up, and we handed out 100 of these. So those lucky enough to get one of our special challenge coins, we gave you instructions for the giveaway. We're giving away an Air Force Airgun Escape. It's like $1,000 air rifle and a box or a case of Firebird targets. So go back to that episode. If you have one of these special coins that we gave out, you're going to get the instructions on what you have to do to get in that drawing for that giveaway. So there you go. We also had our good buddy Ryan Cooperis with the Reasons Outdoors, former Gunnery Sergeant Marine, on that episode. So great episode. Make sure you go back, check it out. This episode, ladies and gentlemen, is going to be action-packed because we have the New York Times bestselling author of 8 books, including the Matt Drake thriller series, Forgotten War, Hostile Intent, The Outside Man, Without Sanction. He also has authored the Tom Clancy Jack Ryan Jr. series, Weapons Grade, Flashpoint, Zero Hunt, Target Acquired. And now he has taken the helm for the Vince Flynn Mitch Rapp series. And he's got a new book coming out next month, first of next month. That'd be September. Capture or Kill, ladies and gentlemen, Don Bentley joining us. Don, welcome in.
Thanks so much for having me, Lefty. And that is some fantastic bumper music you have coming on. I felt like I needed to go start doing deadlifts or something right as that was roaring. So I don't know if I can live up to that, but I'm going to try.
Okay. Was that like the Eagles that you heard, or was it our bumper?
It was not the Eagles. That I am pretty certain of.
Because I had a little, what did I have? It was the Life in the Fast Lane is what I had going.
Oh, okay.
But you missed that, I guess.
Yeah.
I shut it off before you got up. But yeah, we got some pretty pumped up Talking Lead bumper music there. That's the one we've been using that since the very beginning in 2012. It's some kind of I don't know if they're Swedish or Finnish, some kind of heavy metal thrash band. So
yeah, I can see that.
So are you into the gym and weightlifting and
yeah, fitness? I mean, I think I've done jobs most of my life where physical fitness was part of the job, whether that was being in the military or when I was an FBI agent and SWAT guy. And then once I left the FBI, I worked for a couple of small companies, and our customers were folks in the special operations or intelligence communities. And those customers kind of expect you to look a certain way, frankly. And the majority of my coworkers were also folks from the special operations community and stuff. And so it's always the places that I've worked that I've enjoyed the most. Fitness has always been part of the culture.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you look physically fit. Like you're
From the neck up, I'm freaking ripped.
but you said deadlifts, and that I hate deadlifts.
Yeah.
That's the least favorite of any of them.
Oh
But
man, that's the best stress reliever in the world is just doing deadlifts. Love that.
well, there you go. You and Paul Markle, you guys, your deadlifts. Excited to have you on. I really appreciate you taking the time. I mean, we've got a lot that I would like to talk to you about, but I guess
Sure.
let's just kind of go ahead and let's talk about this new Vince Flynn Capture or Kill that you've got coming out. And then I want to get in and talk about and get our listeners to know more about you.
Sure. Yeah, so Capture or Kill is the answer to the question that Vince Flynn fans have been asking for the last 13 years. And that question is, what role did Mitch Rapp play in the mission to capture or kill Osama bin Laden? And so for me, I've always been a huge Mitch Rapp, Vince Flynn fan. Vince was my favorite author of all time. And I read a lot of his books when I was in Afghanistan. From 2005 to 2006, I was an air cavalry troop commander in Afghanistan. And I spent a lot of time in Bagram. And so everywhere around Bagram, there were kind of ad hoc libraries where people would just leave paperback books or hardback books, and you could pick one up or leave one. And so in my mind, Vince and Afghanistan were always kind of tied together. And so in 2011, I was an FBI agent up in Dallas, and I remember standing in my living room watching the TV as President Obama walked out and stepped behind the podium and said, "We just killed bin Laden." And the first thought I had was, good riddance. It's about time somebody wiped that guy off the face of the earth. And then the second thought, as a longtime Vince Flynn fan, was, I wonder what Mitch Rapp had to do with that. So this book answers that question.
Very cool. I can tell you that when, and I remember where I was and what I was doing when President Osama bin Laden came out and made that announcement. I was like, why did it have to be under his administration? But he got the job done. So finally, good riddance to him.
Yeah, I kind of stay clear of politics. I appreciate you certainly have the right to speak your mind either way, but to quote the great Michael Jordan, Republicans got to buy shoes too. And so I just want to write books that people on both sides of the aisle want to buy. Well,
I think you've nailed it with this book. So far, as we were talking, I haven't got the complete thing finished yet, but I'm working on it, and I'm thoroughly enjoying it so far. We had Kyle Mills on a couple of years ago, and he had taken over the mantle for once he passed away, and did an excellent job. I think he had 8 or 9 under his
9, I think. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. So to take that mantle, for you, I mean, it's got to be a huge honor to take over the series now.
Yeah, 100%. And Kyle's a fantastic guy. He is one of the most genuine, nicest human beings I know. In fact, when they announced the transition between he and I, there were a slew of people who rightfully said, like, who is this Bentley guy? Can he do the job? And Kyle Mills went on social media and I swear answered every single person saying, Don's a good guy. He can do this. And just as a fantastic guy. And what I like most about Kyle from a writer's perspective is when Vince passed away from prostate cancer, nobody was even sure whether Mitch Rapp would continue. And so when Kyle agreed to do that, he did not just tread water for 9 books. He made the series bigger. He expanded it. He brought the thunder. And it was an honor to take over for him and an honor to kind of be accepted by the Vince Flynn fans. You mentioned in my intro that I was lucky enough to write for the Tom Clancy franchise too. And there had been enough writers before me that when I took over, it really didn't make any waves. Nobody really cared that much. When they announced it that I was taking over for Kyle, David Brown, who's my publicist, texted me and he said, it's trending on Twitter right now. And the part that was trending on Twitter were people saying, this is my favorite book series in the world. Do not screw this up. And so a little bit of pressure, but also, a good sentiment for them to express, because Vince Flynn, Mitch Rapp, it doesn't belong to me. I'm just a guy that gets to write here for a while.
Well, I can't imagine that you felt too much pressure, given your background as Apache pilot. You said SWAT with the FBI, taking over the Clancy series. I mean, that had to have been kind of a little hesitation, jumping into Tom Clancy world as well. But you handled that, hands down, no problem.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. And background certainly helps, but it's also interesting to remember that Tom Clancy was an insurance salesman with a library card. So he never served in the military, never. And then Vince Flynn was a bartender. Brad Thor was a travel writer. And so there were a lot. Mark Graney had no military or law enforcement experience before he started writing the Gray Man books. And so it certainly helps, but it's also, you have to be somebody that just loves this genre and loves the stuff about it. And when my first book, Without Sanction, came out, I was doing a radio interview, and the interviewer said, "Are you Matt Drake?" Am I my protagonist, who's this DIA spy? And I said, I am absolutely not Matt Drake, but I've stood in the same room with men who could be. And that's a fact, whether it's folks who were my customers when I worked for those small companies, or people who were my coworkers, and a lot of them have found their way into my books. And so even in Capture or Kill, there are many. The opening chapter where there are 3 Rangers mentioned: Brandon Cates, Greg Glass, and Jeff Mishler. They're all friends of mine, and they were all in the Ranger Regiment together. And so I do as much as I can to put a lot of my friends and actual people who have held those roles in the books.
Yeah. So that was leading to one of my questions, because I was going to ask, because those authors that you mentioned didn't have a military background.
Mm-hmm.
You've got a military background. I've had Jack Carr on the show several times. His military background, with his series there with the Terminal List, absolutely phenomenal. It seems to bring a whole nother level of detail to these stories that maybe these non-military types didn't bring. Do you see that you're bringing that aspect to your books that maybe these guys can't, because they didn't live through it?
Yeah, I think there's 2 things. I think readers recognize veracity, and whether they're gun guys or not gun guys, you have an intuitive kind of sixth sense to say, does this feel real or not? And certainly having a military background, having time in the FBI helps with that. I think it also helps to have really cool friends. And so another guy that shows up in Capture or Kill, he's a CIA paramilitary officer. His name's Jason Beefley. In real life, Jason Beefley is one of my closest friends. He spent time in the Ranger Regiment, and then the majority of his Army career in an Army Special Mission Unit. And so he is the guy that I will text and say, "Hey, this is what I want to do. How would you guys actually do this?" And so I actually have like hand-drawn L-shaped ambushes that he's identified for me, or where I want my guys and how I want that to run. And I think that's part of what I bring to it. My books all have kind of an aviation focus to them. And so Capture or Kill has a scene. I flew Apache helicopters. It has a scene in which Apache helicopters in Afghanistan do a area reconnaissance. And the young cavalry troop commander who leads that is a guy named Kelsey Smith, who was one of my best friends. We were troop commanders in Afghanistan. I got out after Afghanistan. He stayed in and retired a colonel. And so he was another one I called, and I was like, "Kels, it's been a while. How do we do this area reconnaissance again?" And so I think my books certainly have more of perhaps a military thriller component to them than maybe some of the ways that Kyle or Vince wrote them. But I think that's part of what you have to do as a writer when you're taking over a legacy series, is you want to stay true to what the originator of that series, what Vince had in mind when he made these characters, when he created this universe. But you also have to bring your own particular expertise and your own tools and your own toolkit as a writer, because nobody can write a book like Vince did. And so if I tried to copy his style, that wouldn't ring true to the reader. And so the best that I can do is try and write my version of fan fiction in the world that he created.
Whiskey River Beef, farm to table with a twist. Come along with us on a quest towards achieving self-sufficiency in food production and fostering a robust local food source to promote good health. Stock up with premium Tennessee beef, unparalleled in flavor and tenderness. You can be confident that you're receiving beef with no added growth hormones or implants. Always pasture-raised, locally USDA processed, and shipped straight to your home. Whiskey River Beef is grass and whiskey mash fed and finished, and is at least 14 days dry aged to enhance the tenderness and give you the most robust flavor imaginable. Go to whiskeyriverbeef.com today to order. Visit us on Instagram at Whiskey River Life and on Facebook at Whiskey River Beef LLC. Whiskey River Beef is a proud sponsor of the Talking Lead podcast and the Leadhead Brigade.
Now, are you continuing the Tom Clancy series?
No, so I'm not continuing that. I am still working on my own projects. In fact, I'm working on a standalone. After the fourth book in my series was called Forgotten War, and that actually took place during the fall of Afghanistan. And as somebody who served in Afghanistan, that just wrecked me. And I kept getting all these text messages and phone calls and emails from fellow veteran friends saying, was it worth it? Was anything that we did over the last 20 years worth it? Was the blood and treasure and tears and time away from our family, was any of that worth it? And I didn't know the answer. And so I wrote Forgotten War partly to try and come to terms with that. And so after that book came out, that was about 2 years ago, my editor at that time was a guy named Tom Colgan, who was also Tom Clancy's editor and the editor for my Clancy books. He said, hey, what I'd love for you to do is work on a standalone book that's a little different story before we come back to Matt Drake. And so that's what I'm doing in my spare time right now, but I'm lucky enough to have more projects than I have time to work on them. And so I'm always kind of staggering what I'm working on at any one moment.
So to take over, an existing series like you did with the Clancy and
yeah,
doing with Vince Flynn here, what kind of research did you do to be able to, again, like you said, you don't want to disappoint the existing fans, but you're also bringing some of your fans over too, I'm sure, that maybe had never been introduced to Vince Flynn's before. So how do you prepare for that?
Yeah, so Vince is my all-time favorite writer, and I'm kind of an overnight success if you discount the 3 books I wrote that nobody cared about in the 17 years it took me to write them, and before I wrote Without Sanction that actually sold and was published. And so when my second attempt at writing a book kind of crashed and burned, I took my favorite Vince Flynn book, which is Protect and Defend, and I note carded it all out. So I took different color note cards for each chapter or each character. And we lived in a little tiny house back then. And so I taped them all to my bedroom wall, which my wife loved. But what it allowed me to do as a writer is to kind of look, it's the difference between looking at a house and looking at the blueprints of a house. And so I could start to see how Vince pulled off some of the things that he did. And so fast forward to the point, a number of years later, where I had the opportunity to come in and write in his universe. And what I wanted to do was to go back specifically to the books that he had written and just immerse myself in his characters as he told that story, as kind of a way of just putting myself in his mind. And so I read his books over and over and over again. And what I discovered that was interesting is that Vince's first Mitch Rapp book was called Transfer of Power. His first book ever was called Term Limits, but his second book, the first one that featured Mitch Rapp, was called Transfer of Power. And what Vince did was aged Mitch with each book. So whatever year, say a book came out in 2007, Mitch was those years old, and the book happened in 2007. And so he kept that up until a book called Pursuit of Honor. And then he stopped the forward progression of the series and he went back in time and he wrote 2 prequels that were kind of like Mitch Rapp's origin stories. And so the first one of those is called American Assassin, and they made a movie from American Assassin. And the second one was Kill Shot. And when he finished Kill Shot, he went back to his original series, but he didn't pick up exactly where Pursuit of Honor left off. He kind of fast forwarded 3 years later and wrote his final book that was called The Last Man. And unfortunately, that was the last book he wrote before he passed away of prostate cancer. And so when I was going back and reading his series, I noticed that gap and I said, that's really interesting. There's this couple year gap in the Mitch Rapp universe where nobody knows what he's up to. And so I started trying to figure out what actual years those were. And lo and behold, one of them was 2011. And I thought, well, that's kind of interesting because there's something that happened in 2011 that kind of changed the world, the Osama bin Laden raid. And so I thought, I wonder if Vince ever talked about that. And so if you go to his website, vinceflint.com, there's a section on there where he answers questions that readers write into him. And lo and behold, one of them was, hey, what was Mitch Rapp doing during the bin Laden raid? And so Vince kind of answered it in a very generic fashion. He said, the SEALs obviously went and did that raid, but to set the conditions for that, there were certainly a whole bunch of intelligence guys and girls running around Afghanistan and Pakistan. In the military, we call that IPB, the intelligence preparation of the battlefield, how you set the conditions for the shooters who are going to go in and do their thing. And so Vince said that's probably what Mitch Rapp was doing. And so when I started researching how the actual raid went down, what the CIA did in order to set the conditions for that, I kind of had the gem of a story. And so it was, once I had that gem of a story, I then had to pitch that idea to two people. And so one of those people was Emily Bessler, who's a phenomenal editor. She was Vince's editor. She was Kyle's editor. She's Brad Thor and Jack Carr's editor. And so I hadn't met
Joe.
I'm sorry.
I hear Emily's name a lot on this show. I've had Brad on, I've had Jack on, I've had all these guys on, and they always talk about Emily and how great she is. And I got to get Emily on the show sometime.
Yeah, she's phenomenal. But I was really intimidated to meet her because she was, such a well thought of editor. And so we hadn't really met maybe once. And I'm pitching her this idea over Zoom, and she's in her kitchen and she's walking back and forth, as I'm pitching it to her. And in my head, I'm like, she hates this. Like, she's about to fire me. And she's just, she's waiting for me to stop talking. And so I kind of peter out and say, and so that's what I'm thinking. So she stops and looks in the camera and says, I love it. You should do it. And so that was the first check. And the second one was Vince's agent. And so the two people who are kind of the guardians of Vince's legacy are Emily Bessler and then Vince's literary agent, a guy named Sloan Harris, who's another mega star in this industry. And so I'm talking to Sloan on the phone and I'm like, here's my idea. And I get to the end and he pauses for a little bit and he says, so are you telling me that Mitch Rapp is going to be number 2 in the stack behind Rob O'Neill? Is that what's going to happen? And I'm like, that's not what's going to happen. And I had no idea what was going to happen, but I knew that wasn't going to happen. And so those are kind of the things that led me to write and Capture or Kill.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. I can't wait to get more into it. But leading up to it so far, I mean, it's got you, by the grips, and I want to keep reading. So
I appreciate that. I think you said you're about 2 pages in, so I'm glad that for the first 2 pages I've held your attention.
I am right here. 16, so. But no, I mean, the first page, after reading the first page, you had me hooked on the first.
Thank you.
So, and I think I heard in an interview, you were talking, and you said that you had 3 books that, in your opinion, weren't very successful, and you were asking your colleagues and your friends, what do I need to do here? And you had talked about going back and reading some of the people who were the best sellers that were on the shelves right there, and who do you want to be next to?
Yep.
And kind of seeing what they did to do that. And with going back that far, and thinking about that, how did that play from that point forward into your writing?
Yeah, so I appreciate you classifying my 3 books that I should have taken out and burned in the backyard is not successful by my estimation. They were not successful by anybody in the planet's estimation. And that they never saw the light of day. Nobody wanted to, so I sent those out and nobody wanted to buy them. And so they're what's affectionately called trunk manuscripts, where they disappear into the trunk of your car or the shelf and never come out. But
Learning.
Yes. No. And that's absolutely true. You know, when people ask me about how do I become a better writer, I'm like, listen, most writers I know have written 3 or 4, maybe more books that weren't quite ready yet. And if you
unless you're
unless you're who?
Unless you're Jack Carr.
Yeah, Jack Carr is what we call a mystery wrapped up in an enigma. He is one of a kind, and I know him quite well. He's a super great guy. What I tell folks is that the person that you see on social media is actually him. Like, he's just as genuine and caring of a guy in person as he is on social media and stuff. But you know, if you were a woodworker instead of a writer and you wanted to make cabinets for a living, chances are the first cabinet you tried to make would not be something that maybe your mom might want that, but most people would not want that. And so it's the same thing as writing. There's going to be stuff that you have to learn, and most of us don't figure that out on the first time. And so, to your point, the editor for my Matt Drake books and my Clancy books, Tom Colgan, he told me that to be a writer, a new writer, debuting in a genre like thrillers, you have to do something that's the same but different. And so what he meant, Brad Taylor is a great friend of mine and has kind of been a big brother to me in this industry. And he's a former Delta Force troop and squadron commander. He writes the New York Times best-selling Pike Logan books. And so my books are in the same genre as Brad. So we should be on the shelf next to each other, but I'm never going to write a better Brad book than Brad does. And so what I had to do is say, what are the things that I'm going to do that are the same but different to kind of set my books apart from Brad or Mark Graney or Jack Carr or Brad Thor or Vince Flynn? And so that's part of the growth too as a writer, is you have to decide what you're intentionally going to do that's different. And in order to do that, you have to be a student of the genre that you want to write in. You should be able, when I meet somebody and they say, hey, I want to write fantasy. And I'm like, okay, great. So tell me the 3 fantasy bestsellers right now that your book should be on the shelf next to. And if they can't tell me that, then I say you have not done enough homework yet. Because again, going back to the woodworking analogy, if you wanted to build cabinets for a living, you have to know what kind of cabinets are being sold right now. How many knobs do they have? What kind of wood is being used? All of that stuff, because you are at the end of the day building a product for a certain customer, and that customer has expectations. Now, from a reading perspective, a thriller reader might not be able to tell you that, but what they will say is, yeah, this book was kind of slow. Or, you know, this book just didn't grab me for this reason. Because if you read a Brad Taylor book where a body gets dropped in the first chapter, and then I try and write a book that nobody gets killed for the first 150 pages, that reader's going to have some dissonance between that two. And so it's kind of like, you got to know the rules before you break the rules. You got to spend a lot of time reading in your genre to understand what those genre conventions are before you want to write in it.
Yeah, and that's great advice, and I probably should take that myself. I make it a point not to listen to other podcasts that are somewhat related to mine at all. I don't, because I don't want to be accused of stealing or copying or, you know, anything like that. So
I think that's true, and it changes some once you've made it, so to speak, into that. So now there are a lot of times, like Brad was one of my favorite writers when I was just a reader, but he's written books, like he wrote a book about China, and I still have never read it because I was writing a book about China for that same reason, because you don't want to be derivative, or you don't. But that's after you've already entered the industry and you understand it. And in your case, presumably you did that research before you ever launched your podcast.
No, I didn't know.
Or not.
when we started. It's been fumble stumble for 12 years. But it's been great because we've had a lot of, great guests on. And one that we had on was also a former Apache pilot, Jeff Kirkham. You familiar with Jeff?
I'm not. Do you know when he got out of the Army?
He was sometime around the same time you were, and then he got into the CIA and was doing stuff with them. But he wrote is writing a series, Black Autumn. It's kind of like a post-apocalyptic kind of series. It's been very successful, and I think they're in talks with doing TV series or something like that.
That's awesome.
But I was just curious if you knew him. He also he's an entrepreneur. He developed the Rats tourniquet. I don't know if you're familiar with this tourniquet. And, anyway, he's a great guy.
Yeah, the Apache community is actually pretty small. It used to be smaller when they still had the helicopter called the AH-64 Delta, the little scout helicopter with the ball on top. It's a little bigger now because many of those pilots, when they phased that helicopter out, became Apache pilots. But other than my very first assignment in flight school, everywhere we went after that, we knew people and had, family and friends waiting for us.
I'm stupid. I didn't mean Jeff Kerfoot. I meant Butch Whiting. You probably.
Oh, I know him. Yeah, he does. He does I didn't realize he was a writer too. He has the camouflage company.
I got him and Jeff completely. Like I said, I've had Butch Whiting was the Apache helicopter guy that I had on. Not that I know that he's written anything, but the Cryptech.
Cryptech, yeah. So Butch and I were
on a couple of times. Yeah,
we were in what's called the advanced course together. So once you're done being a staff officer and before you take company or troop command, you go back to the schoolhouse for like 8 or 9 months or something. And so we were there together. Yeah, I know him well.
Sorry, Jeff. But Jeff is an author also, but he did serve, I think, during the time that you did as well. He did a lot of a secret squirrel kind of stuff.
If he wasn't an Apache pilot, I really don't care about Jeff. I'll be honest with you.
You probably gave him some support. But I've had several of the 160th guys on the show as well. Greg Coker. Are you familiar with Greg Coker?
So I don't know a lot of 160th folks. I did have several friends who went and flew little birds from the Apache community for a number of reasons. One, because you're for the same reason that everybody wants to go special operations. But the second one being that in conventional aviation, like the rest of the big Army, you would do 1-year tours in Iraq or Afghanistan and sometimes longer than that. The 160th deploys a lot more, but their tours are shorter and they don't move. They stay at Fort Campbell or Savannah or what have you for the most part. So there are a lot of, I don't know a lot of them, but I have several friends that were in the 160th.
Okay, cool. I was thinking that I heard an interview that you did where you were talking about the 160th or
so
you confused with something
else. No. So in Afghanistan, because the 160th, their own gunships are their little birds and then their UH-60 or MH-60 DAPs. In Afghanistan, where we were, the terrain was high enough that the little birds couldn't fly that high, and their DAPs were, for the most part, all in Iraq supporting operations there. And so there were quite a few times in Afghanistan that we, the customers, which a lot of times were Navy SEALs or other folks, would request gunship support. And so the 160th would fly them in their Chinooks, and then we as the Apache pilots would provide support for them. And so for me, that it happened. There were a couple of operations that we did intentionally where you schedule it all out and you plan to go do it. There was another one that I was a part of where I was the air mission commander for the quick reactionary force for Operation Red Wing. So once the 4 SEALs got into contact and went missing, we were flying. It was myself and my wingman and another Apache, and then 2 conventional Blackhawks full of Marines that were flying to try and go rescue them, along with two MH-47s, two 160th Chinooks that were full of Navy SEALs, and it was a tragic day. The lead Chinook was shot down by an RPG, and I couldn't stop it. And so until the Extortion 17 strategy, or Extortion 17 tragedy, that day, June 28th, 2005, was the day that the most SEALs in the history of the SEALs were killed. And so it was pretty horrible.
Yeah. And you do an interview with Jack Carr, and you talk good detail in that. So if you guys want to hear more about that, because I don't want you to have to relive that right now, but great interview that you did with Jack Carr. So you guys can go back and check that interview out and hear the backstory on that.
The Acro 10-liter EDC sling bag is a perfect daily commuter or versatile carry-on travel companion. Designed to meet the needs of modern commuters and travelers seeking both functionality and security, the Acro 10-liter sling bag offers an array of organizational options in a comfortable platform. Whether you're a daily commuter, law enforcement professional, or a weekend warrior, this sling bag caters to your lifestyle with utmost precision. The dedicated, discreet concealed firearm compartment is ambidextrous with quick access. The Acro series is constructed from durable materials that are designed to withstand the elements and rugged environments.
Mission First Tactical is the official tactical accessories provider for the Talking Lead podcast and the Leadhead Brigade. Use the code LEADHEAD for an exclusive 20% discount on all orders.
Were you part of the Osama bin Laden? Did you have anything?
Oh, no. I was an FBI agent at the time in Dallas. So no, I had nothing to do with it. Everything is, so the book, that part of the book for me was all research, but it's really, really interesting. Certainly there have been books written about, like Zero Dark 30, about the SEALs, or by the SEALs who did it. And then I forget what the other book is. Is it No Easy Day or something like that? But it's when you go back and you look at how they figured out that bin Laden was there, the different methods they used, some of the really neat intelligence work that CIA officers did, a lot of that makes its way into the book. And what's interesting for me is when we sit on this side of the history, everything seems inevitable because we know how it turned out. And so we don't get a feel for what the folks in the moment were going through. So for instance, we look at the invasion of Normandy at D-Day as a foregone conclusion that was successful, because from our vantage point, it was, where the people in the middle of it really didn't know whether that invasion was going to be successful or not. And the bin Laden raid is the same way. President Biden famously talks about how he told President then at the time, Obama, not to do the raid because, for a litany of reasons. And so when you look at it from that perspective and what was on the line and what the repercussions were, imagine if the Pakistani Air Force had detected those helicopters come in, or if, when the raid happened, the SEALs would have gotten in a firefight with potentially Pakistani police who were responding, or all of those different things. You can see that operation was not the slam dunk that we perhaps look at it, having now had the benefits of understanding that it was successful. And so I tried to capture some of that in the book as well.
So looking back at, where was I going with this? Anyway, I was so enthralled with what you were saying there. I forgot what my next
question. Bored. I put you to sleep. We can be honest. Be honest.
I had the train of thought going, and then but anyway, I want to get into your aviation background and your aviation history. How did you originally get involved with the Army and wanting to get into with the Apaches? How did that happen?
Yeah, so I grew up, I was the third generation in my family to serve. My grandfather had been drafted for World War II and my father for Vietnam. And so And my son actually was just commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Marine Corps, so he'll be the fourth generation.
Yeah.
So yeah, we're super proud of him. But I like to say that I am the first one to voluntarily serve. Those two were both drafted, and so I grew up in a very patriotic home. I think knew I wanted to go into the military from a pretty early age. My dad is a huge aviation nut. He worked for GE aircraft engines for the majority of his career, designing jet engines. He had his pilot's license. He actually built a kit plane when I was in college, first in the garage, and then he rented a hangar once it got too big to fit in the garage. And so I grew up flying with him and wanted to fly. And so when it came time to figure out what I was going to do, my dad had talked about how he was in Air Force ROTC when he was in college, but his vision got worse. And so he ended up dropping out of ROTC because he knew he wouldn't be able to fly. And so that loomed pretty heavily in my decision-making process, and thought, I'd love to go in the Air Force and fly planes, but I don't know what you would do over there if you couldn't fly planes. You'd be a weather guy or something. I don't know. And so the Army, if you can't fly helicopters, they let you blow stuff up or ride around in tanks or do whatever. And so that seemed like a better choice to me. And the Army saw fit to give me a scholarship where the Air Force did not. And so that helped make the decision a little easier too. But the way it works is that in college, in an ROTC, they develop an Order of Merit list, and that has everything from your grades to your performance. They call it advanced camp, where you do this military training thing. Maybe the summer between your junior and senior year, to your professor of military sciences recommendation. And so they come up with this list, and you pick, and then the Army has needs. And if you're high enough up on that list, you usually get what you want. And if you're lower on the list, you kind of get the needs of the Army. And so I was fortunate enough to be high enough on the list, and my eyes held out long enough to be able to get aviation. And then once you get aviation, you go to what's called the Officer Basic School. And so it takes about 12 months or something to get your wings. And in that time, there's another Order of Merit list. And so you're ranked, and they have 4 different helicopters you choose from. And so based on how high you are on that list and the needs of the Army, you may get the helicopter you want, you may not. And so again, I was fortunate where I was high enough on the list, and the Army needed enough Apache pilots that I got lucky twice and got aviation, and then got Apaches after that. And so Apaches has the longest, they call it the aircraft qualification course. It's where you transition. When I was in flight school, you flew the military version of the Jet Bell Ranger because it was cheaper to fly, and you didn't go into your advanced aircraft until you had your wings. Now they've gone back to that now so that you can get more time in the advanced aircraft. But so the first time you fly that Apache is when you start the aircraft qualification course, and the Apache is the longest one. The Black Hawk is the shortest one. The Apache is the longest one. And part of it is because the mission set of the Apaches is very, very different. You're a weapons platform. You're a gunship pilot. It's much more complex. The second part of it is that in the Apache, you don't fly necessarily with night vision goggles. You fly with the system that has, on the front of the Apache are 2 balls. One's a small ball, and it's called the PINVIS, or the Pilot Night Vision System. And one's a much bigger ball that has a laser, a day TV, and a forward-looking infrared. And that's called the TADS, or the Target Acquisition Designation System. And so the 2 pilots each fly with one of those sensors. And it has a little, I think now they're going to like the F-35, where it projects on your visor. But at the time, there would be something called the HDU, the Helmet Display Unit, that would slide over your right eye. And so as you turned your head, inside that cockpit, there was a bath of infrared light, and the computer could tell where your eye was and how your helmet turned. And so that big sensor on the front would move as your head turned. And so you had to learn how to fly outside with your right eye, and then look at your instruments and such with your left eye. And so it's a very, very challenging. There's a phase of flying and it's called the bag, where you learn how to do that. And they call it the bag because it's an extremely high-tech solution in that they take garbage bags and tape it over all the windows so you can't see outside. And so your instructor pilot sits in the front seat and keeps you from killing yourself. And you sit in the back seat with the bag all taped up. And because you're concentrating so hard and it gets hot in there with the bag, like you're drenched in sweat and you're just like, ah. And so it is very, very hard. And it's not uncommon for folks to fail portions of that and have to get additional hours. And actually I did that. Like I failed a check ride in the bag and had to go back and get additional hours and stuff. But once you learn how to do that, it becomes very, very powerful, because when you're flying at night or in combat and stuff, you can actually look through the helicopter. So you take your head and look down and you're looking through the floor of the helicopter, because you're actually seeing via this sensor that sits on the helicopter's nose. So once you learn how to do it, it's very powerful, but it's very, very difficult at first.
It's like seasoning a cast iron skillet. Use it that few times and it builds up in there. Our product, CLP Plus, is a bio-based, non-toxic, complete gun care. Your cleaning time will be reduced by over 50%. I like to say it's a clean shoot, clean shoot, clean shoot, for it to fully remove whatever product you've had on there before. It's like seasoning a cast iron skillet. So all I like to do is you'll field strip it like this, go piece by piece. Basically all I do, I'll take the nylon brush into the paste, and you start covering. Come back, clean each piece, and then even on the handles, on the outside and on the inside. With our product, you wipe it all off. You don't leave any on there. From grains and all, stick it in. It's safe on all metals, plastics, composites, wood, rubber, leather. I just use a nylon brush and then a bore jag with one of our pre-saturated patches. You put it in, swipe, coming back, you can see what it's pulled out. And this was a brand new firearm. With our product, your malfunctions from carbon buildup are virtually eliminated, because carbon will not be building up. There's nothing to stick to. And all of our product is USA source and made. Grab the microfiber cloth and back, and you'll wipe it off, and you'll wipe all the product off now. There you go. It's that simple.
Seal One is a proud sponsor of the Talking Lead podcast and the Leadhead Brigade. Use the code LEADHEAD for a 25% off discount.
How much or how many hours of your flight time would you say were night?
So in Apaches, the majority of missions you do at night. And so they always tried to get it so that you were at 50% of your flight hours or more were night hours. And so I don't know if it actually breaks down that way, because a lot of times you have a couple different metrics that are competing. So one is your currency, where you have to fly so many times a month in order just to stay relevant. And then you have like your night currency, and then your fully mission qualified currency to be out. So now we're not talking about just flying the helicopter. We're actually talking about employing the helicopter as a weapons system. And so sometimes you could only get day flights and you just needed a flight to stay current. So you'd do a day flight versus a night flight or something like that. So I don't know. When I got my senior aviator badge in Afghanistan, which means I had a total of 1,000 hours. And once you get that 1,000-hour mark, you get I think it's a little star. So you get your wings and a star over it. And so I don't know the breakdown, how many of those were night hours, but the goal when you were a platoon leader and you were making the flight schedule was always to try and keep your total hours flown at 50% or more, because that was what was reflective. You were going to do the majority of your missions at night.
Now, while you were deployed in Afghanistan during Operation Enduring Freedom, you were awarded some medals, the Bronze Star Medal and the Air Medal with V.
Yeah.
For valor. Talk about those.
Yeah. So the Bronze Star Medal is one that is not, so a lot of, I guess I should say, a lot of people come back with a combat deployment with a Bronze Star Medal, because that's sort of one of the standard ones for you deployed and you come back after after that, and you get a Bronze Star medal. The Air Medal with V device are for valor, or if somebody has a Bronze Star with V device, the V device is something different, and it usually signifies that you had a bad day and things went wrong. And so for me, the Air Medal was awarded several Air Medals while I was there, and that was, your flying combat missions. And so after every so many hours of flying combat missions, you're eligible for an Air Medal. The Air Medal with V device was from June 28th, 2005, that kind of mission that I alluded to before. And so it's kind of the double-edged sword when you have awards like that. You have them because something usually went terribly wrong. And so they're kind of commending you for bravery or whatever. But I think most people don't think about being brave. I was personally scared out of my mind. You're thinking about everything that went wrong that day and how you wish you could have that moment back again to maybe try and make it go right next time.
Talk about one of your most memorable, not tragic stories of an oh shit moment while you were flying.
It's I guess kind of sort of related to something tragic, but it helped drive home for me what it meant to be a servant leader. So when you're an officer in the Army, they drive home to you that your job, especially when you're a young platoon leader, is to take care of soldiers. And so the way that plays out, so in aviation, when you go to the field, because we're aviators, we take a kitchen with us, and there are cooks that cook meals. And your job as an officer is you eat last. And so you watch all your guys and girls, all your troopers go by for two things. One, it's your opportunity to check on the men and women that you lead to see how they're doing. And number two, if the food runs out, they should eat before you eat. Now, as an aviator, the food never runs out, because if we're not full, the helicopters don't fly. It's just science. But another way that kind of manifests is that there's a tradition in the military where during Thanksgiving and Christmas and things like that, as an officer or as a senior non-commissioned officer, you get dressed up in your dress blues or dress mess, and you go to the dining facility and you serve your junior soldiers a meal because they're far away from home. They don't have any family, and your job as a leader is to take care of them. Now, the flip side of that is you're taking care of them because at some point in time, you may lead them into combat, and you're going to ask them to do things that can be detrimental to their health or could result in their death. And they're going to do it not because you outrank them. They're going to do it because you have built that relationship with them, and they know that you care for them, and they're doing it for that reason. And so when I was a troop commander in Afghanistan, we didn't lose any Apaches to enemy fire. We did lose at least one Chinook. We had some Apaches that were shot up pretty badly, but we lost two Apaches to pilots who overflew the conditions. And what I mean by that is we were the first longbow Apache helicopters into Afghanistan. And the reason why that's significant is the longbow, the Delta model Apache, is 4,000 or 5,000 pounds, I can't remember, heavier than its predecessor, than the Alpha model Apache. But at the time, we had the same engines, so much heavier, but the same engines means we were very, very power limited in the summertime. In fact, it was not uncommon to not have enough power to hover. And so when you would take off, you would kind of bounce along the ground, and you'd try and get to 18 or 20 knots, which is called effective transitional lift, before you hit the HESCO barriers on the far side of the FOB, which was always a fun thing to go through. And so at Bagram at night, my friends, a warrant officer and a young lieutenant in his troop, were flying a practice mission for the SEALs, where the SEALs were calling in Apache gunships. And this instructor pilot had a reputation for pushing the envelope and potentially pushing the envelope too far. And so you can have this dynamic in aviation crews where you have a very experienced senior pilot and a very inexperienced junior pilot. And so what can happen is that the junior pilot doesn't feel comfortable speaking up and saying, hey, I don't feel comfortable with this. And that kind of was the dynamic here. And so this more senior pilot was turning tighter and tighter, and was getting upset because he had missed several engagements and he was feeling the pressure from the SEALs on the ground. And so as he turned, he overflew the limits of the helicopter and he flew it into the ground. And so the backseater, that pilot, in the backseat, there's a lot of room. There's a lot of crash space so that the cockpit can kind of crumple around you. In the front seat, they used to have this, and you can see it in that picture right there, that it's sticking out of the dashboard, this piece of wonderful 1970s technology called the ORT. And it was this optical relay tube that you could put your head down in. And nobody ever did that because nobody would want to have their head down there. But when you crash, a lot of times the front seater would take that to the head. And so in this case, the lieutenant was very, very badly hurt. In fact, I remember going in to see him at the hospital right after it happened with my first sergeant. And I walked in and I knew he was hurt, but seeing him there and seeing his broken body and seeing him on the ventilator and everything, like, it just shook me to the core, because for the first time, I felt like I wasn't invulnerable. Like, up until that point, I'm like, there's nothing anybody can do to hurt me. I'm bulletproof in this helicopter. And I'm looking and seeing this pilot laying in this bed, and I know I'm not bulletproof anymore. And to the point that I don't know, obviously, what kind of expression I had on my face, but I remember my first sergeant grabbing me and saying, come on, sir, let's just get out of here. And so I came. Yeah, you can see it there too. It's a good, you can see there's very little room there when the helicopter goes through a crash sequence in the front seat. And so the next day, or rather that night, my best friend, who was the troop commander, came over and he said, hey, we got to fly tomorrow. And I'm asking all of the commanders to be the ones who fly. Like, we need to set the example for everybody else. And I knew immediately he was right. And I also knew that I did not want to fly because, you know, it had shaken me terribly. I was scared out of my mind, but I climbed in the helicopter the next day, not because I wasn't scared, but because it was the right thing to do. Because as a leader, you never ask your men and women to do something that you're not willing to do. That's what it means to take care of soldiers. That's what it means. That's what servant leadership or sacrificial leadership actually looks like. And so that was one of my, I think, prouder moments. Just proud to be a leader, proud to have friends like my buddy that said, this is what we need to do. And if you want to get a better sense of that, I think when people ask me, what was it like to be in the war on terror? What was it like to lead men and women in combat? I always tell them to go read Outlaw Platoon by Sean Parnell, because that book really is the We Were Soldiers Once and Young from my generation. Because Sean, in that book, he's a young infantry platoon leader with his guys in Afghanistan. And it's not like one of those memoirs where it's a bunch of chest pounding and he talks about how great he was. It's a study of Sean trying to figure out, what do I have to do as a leader to be worthy of these men who are following me into combat? And it's fantastic.
That's what was the name of that book again?
It's called Outlaw Platoon.
Outlaw Platoon. What's
Yep.
Sean's name?
Sean Parnell.
Sean Parnell. There you go. I remember the question that I was going to ask you that I had the brain fart on earlier. It seems like, you know, when I say you guys, I'm talking about the political action thriller spy novelists like Jack and Stephen Hunter and Kyle and Brad. And it's like you have a crystal ball, because it seems like a lot of the books that you guys write, the things that either they're happening right when your books come out, or, you know, they happen a few months or whatever after your books come out. What do you attribute that to? How do you guys have such a grasp on what's going on that, lo and behold, there it is?
Yeah, I think two things. So one, in this genre, you have to constantly be reading about current events and geopolitical events and political stuff. Like I have probably 3 or 4 different aggregate services, news aggregate services that I get articles from every morning. And I usually read them when I'm eating my cereal in the morning. And so you're constantly in your head paying attention to what's going on in the world, because your job is to tell stories, relevant stories that the reader says, yeah, this is fiction, but I can kind of see how it would be fact. And so you're constantly straddling that, not trying to beat current events, but to tell realistic stories based on the conditions in the world right now. Mm-hmm. And that's one aspect of it. I think the second aspect, in particular for folks who have served in the military or have been military officers, is there is a position in every battalion that's called the S2, and that is the intelligence officer. It's the man or woman who is charged with giving the intelligence briefs and things like that. And when you do operations, that man or woman puts on what's called the red hat. And so it's their job to be the enemy commander and to predict, as the friendly forces lay out their plan, here's my plan of attack, here's what I'm going to do. It's almost like a game of chess. And that person's job is to play the enemy commander and do the counter moves to whatever plan the S3 or the operations officer has put together. And so every officer has that role at some point in their career, even if it's not a formal role as the S2. You might be a platoon leader and your company commander will say, okay, we're going to write this operations order. I want you to put on your red hat and tell me what you think the enemy is going to do. And so it's a very, putting yourself in the antagonist position is a very useful skill for a thriller writer, right? And sometimes it comes back to bite you in the butt. My third book, Hostile Intent, I had written Without Sanction and The Outside Man, and I really wanted to write a book that was more military thriller. I wanted to do a force-on-force conflict in Europe. And so at the time I thought, what would be interesting? I'm like, what about a Russian invasion of Ukraine? And so I wrote that whole book in like 2 months before it came out. Lo and behold, Russia invaded Ukraine. And so I still get letters from readers now and like, why did you mess this up? It doesn't end the way it happened. And I'm like, because I wrote it 9 months before Russia invaded Ukraine. And so, that's kind of a risk that you run as a thriller writer, and especially somebody who writes military thrillers or espionage thrillers. But that's really what you're trying to do, is to tell believable stories in the real world.
And when you talk about the Ukraine war, I mean, you had something that came out, prior. Brad had something. I think Jack's on some of that too. It just seems like you guys are just so in touch with it. Where are you getting your reliable sources of news and information? Because you can't rely on Google or any of these search engines to give you reliable data on what it is you're exactly looking for, because they're going to put in front of you what they want you to see.
Yeah, I listen to a lot of podcasts. One of my favorite is Hugh Hewitt, and I like him because I think he's a smart guy, but he also has really interesting folks who come on to his podcasts that are journalists, that are foreign journalists. And so, for instance, once I got out of the FBI and before I wrote full time, several different instances I worked either with or for Israeli companies. And so I have, after 10/7 happened, the company I was working for right before I left to go write full time was a wholly owned subsidiary of an Israeli company. And our founder was part of one of the Israeli special operations folks. And so after 10/7 happened, I was looking for information, for people who had a unique viewpoint into the Israeli mind, into what was actually going on. And so there's a guy named Haviv something Garrett or something like that. I'm messing up his name, but he was a frequent guest on the Hugh Hewitt show. And so I would listen to him talk, and then I would listen to what different newspapers or other news sources that he would reference, and then I would go read those, and then I would use that to go find something else or some. And so I think you're constantly doing that aggregation and stuff and saying, where do I get my news? Where are other places? Like there's one of my aggregation services, and I found this one from Hugh Hewitt too, is called News Items by John Ellis. And so it's more geographically focused, but it has some really interesting things around what's happening in China, kind of world events. I also listen. I'm a subscriber to National Review, and from a politics side, right? Because I write a lot of stuff about politics. And so there's one that's called the Morning Jolt by Jim Garrity, who's a fantastic writer and a novelist too. And so and so I think what you have to do as a writer is very few times have I had something served to me. What you get in an aggregate is, hey, this is an interesting idea. And then I go research that further and find other news sources and other things like that. And a lot of what I do as a writer, as somebody who writes thrillers, is that kind of research. I have one of my email folders is just labeled, research or ideas. And so when I come across news articles or stories or newspaper things that are interesting, I'll just copy the link and throw it in that folder. And every so often I'll go through and review those and say, what are some interesting things that I stumbled across? And do I think any of those could carry the weight of an actual book? And so if you're going to write in this genre, you have to enjoy doing that research, and you have to consume a lot of podcasts, a lot of news shows, a lot of written news. It's just part of the job.
When do you have time to do all that with 3-4 novels that you're writing, and then your family? And my gosh, son.
Yeah, my days start pretty early. I normally get up about 5, and I try and get to my desk pretty soon after that. For me, I kind of break those up into 2 chunks. And so writing is what pays the bills, and I have to do so much of that every day. And I'm more productive of that in the morning. And then afternoons and stuff is where I do more of the research, or try and figure out what are the gaps in the book that I'm working on right now. What doesn't feel right? What's the thing? I think the more books you write, you don't know necessarily what the next book is going to be, but you know it when you see it. And so you kind of get that tingly feeling when you read something. You're like, there's something there. But the only way you get that is, like I said, you got to consume a lot of news, a lot of media. And then you find that idea that kind of gives you tingles, and maybe it's that one, or maybe it leads you to another idea. But it's like a lot of work. I don't get to take nearly as many naps as I thought I'd be able to as a writer. I'm still kind of disappointed about that.
Is there a lot of whiskey involved with your late night writings? Or
I do early morning writing, and so whiskey is frowned upon early in the morning. And in fact, when I still had a day job, I used to go, there's a coffee shop that I'll go to that's very dangerous because they serve amazing coffee, and they're also a brewery. And so you can very easily make the transition from coffee to beer. And then for me, at least, I know Stephen King has talked about writing entire books while he was high on cocaine, but I don't have that gift. Once you start drinking a beer, you tend to write more words, and then you look at them later and you're like, I should have just stuck with coffee.
So, how did you get into the writing aspect of this? I mean, you military, Army. Did you transition from Army right to FBI, or was there a gap there where you did maybe something else before you went to the FBI?
I got out of the Army in 2007, and then my wife and I are high school sweethearts. We moved back to our hometown where our parents were, and we bought our forever house, which we don't use those words anymore because that was 5 houses ago. And I got a really great job at a really great company, and hated it not because of the company. Yeah, it was a corporate job. I was sitting in a cubicle. I came home and told my wife, after the first week, that I didn't really understand that movie Office Space before, but now I was living it. And and I think that's more like kind of a tangential thing. People who are veterans, and especially folks who served in combat, you don't realize how much of who you are is tied up in what you did until you're not doing that anymore. And then you are trying to figure out who you are and what you draw purpose from. And so for me, what I had to do is finally find a profession that allowed me to do things that I thought that mattered for the people that I cared about. And for me, those people were the ones that were still going into harm's way on our nation's behalf. And it took me a while to figure that out. But from a writing perspective, I've always been a storyteller ever since I was a little kid. I grew up in the 80s where they had amazing shows like the A-Team and Knight Rider and Airwolf and all of that. Yeah. And so I just remember looking at those and thinking, hey, wouldn't it have been cool if they would have done this instead? And so in grade school, I was writing endings to TV shows. And in high school, I started trying to work on my first book and didn't really know what I was doing. And so when I was in college, I worked on a couple of books that went nowhere too. And so finally, about 2001, I decided to get serious about it. And so I would get up at about 4:30 in the morning and write before I went in to do physical training every day, and just kept grinding at it until I got good enough to make a living doing it. So
the Firebird M50 targets are a new low-noise version of our popular 50 bio-detonating target. M50 targets are self-contained, pyrotechnic, reactive targets that are legal, safe, and easy to transport. Use the exclusive code TL15 for 15% off all orders at firebirdtargets.com. Firebird Targets is a proud sponsor of the Talking Lead podcast and the Leadhead Brigade. I've got some listener questions, so let's jump to our listener questions.
Okay.
Don't have a lot. We got a few. And we reward our listeners on this show. So those who participated, we're going to pick a winner. And I've got some swag from the GOA convention that I'm going to award.
That's awesome.
One of you listeners there with. So first question, or maybe this is just a comment. Car Racer 36. Man, I miss Vince. I used to go to readings of his book launches. So,
yeah, he's incredible. I never got to meet him, but I've been fortunate enough to meet a lot of people who knew him very well. And so I always ask them to tell me Vince stories afterwards. And you can tell who knew him growing up because they don't call him Vince. They all call him Vinny. And they all have stories about how his sister used to babysit their nephew or something to that extent. But you can even now still hear the love for him among their readers. He was just a great guy and a fantastic writer.
Next question, Mustang Perry. I think we just answered this one. Thank you for your service. What got you into writing, or has it always been a passion? I think you kind of just answered that one.
Yeah, it's always storytelling has always been a passion, but it took a while for me to get the tools I needed to be able to tell the kind of stories I wanted to in a way that would be commercially viable.
Behurst 87, Apache, little hearts. They hold a special place in my heart. Hellfire and Brrr. What different, or what is your favorite loadouts that are available now? Thank you for your service, sir.
Yeah, so the Hellfire missile, when I was flying, there was only still one variant of it. It was originally designed as a tank-killing weapon. And in fact, when we went to Afghanistan, we didn't even take our Hellfires because we were so underpowered. We stripped off all the Hellfire racks and the radar on top, and we just used 30 millimeter and rockets, which are very effective too. There are a bunch of different rocket loads we carried, including flechettes and high explosives and white phosphorus. But now there are many different variants of Hellfires, including this one they call like the Ninja Hellfire, where it's made for very close quarters where you want to limit collateral damage. And it doesn't even have a warhead, but it has these crazy knives that come out of the missile actually when it hits the target. And it's designed just to kill the guy in the front seat without taking out the people standing on the street next to him.
Have you had any input on future designs or improvements to the Apache?
No, but there are a lot of one of the guys that was my instructor pilot when I was a young captain works out at Boeing now, and so that's very, very common. In fact, when I was writing 0 Hour, one of my Tom Clancy books, I had it in North Korea, and Apaches were very, very heavily featured in that book, and so I actually got to go back to Boeing and fly the newest Apache flight simulator, which is. I told my wife it was kind of like riding a bike. It is not like riding a bike. I thoroughly embarrassed myself, but it was fun.
That's cool. So I've got a question.
Yeah.
More of a maybe a wish list kind of deal. So, with all these amazing genres of authors with the spy thriller genre, have you guys ever thought about maybe teaming up on maybe like, the Vince Flynn and everybody take a chapter or two and just put their own kind of twist to it? It's like, all right, you get the first, he gets the middle, he gets the end, and let's just kind of see where that goes. I mean, I think that would be awesome for you guys to, like they did in music. A lot of these musicians will get together and they'll do like a collaboration of a redo of like the Eagles or something like that, and they're always amazing. So I think it would be great if you got a group of you guys together and either come up with your own book or take Vince Flynn and run with it that way. You ever had a suggestion that
I get a lot of people asking for that, and I tell them it's probably a snowball's chance in hell of that ever happening. But my caveat on it is there's an organization called the International Thriller Writer, and they will do anthologies like short stories. And so there was one year, I can't remember if they called it Face Off or something like that, but they had a bunch of it. Like Lee Child, I remember Lee Child and Joe Finder wrote a short story together where it was Jack Reacher and I forget Joseph Finder's character were in a short story together. And so it might happen maybe, but I wouldn't get my hopes up.
I'm not saying bring your characters together in a book, but just take a book and then just everybody just chop it up and you take the first part, you take the second, just see kind of where it goes. I think that'd be kind of interesting. But
that sounds like a nightmare to me. I'm like, I don't want anybody touching my stuff. This is my stuff. But
authors are territorial. I get it.
Exactly.
Well, Don, I really appreciate you taking the time to be on. Like you said, you got to cut out. I've got a lot more questions for you that I wanted to ask and get into. I want to talk more about your FBI background, and maybe we can have you back on again sometime and talk about it.
Yeah, I didn't, like I said, I don't know if I got my wires crossed with David or not, but I didn't realize that he is the keeper of my schedule. And so if you reach out back to him, he might be able to slot you back in the next week or so if you wanted to do that, I think.
Well, just maybe when things cool down, we'll have you back on and
sure.
We'll just, talk about you and get your ideas on some other things that I wanted to talk about. But the book is the Vince Flynn Capture or Kill Mitch Rapp novel. This is Don's first go at it, and I think he's knocked it out of the park so far. I can't wait to read the rest of it. Who does the audio versions of these? Do you?
Yeah, so it recently changed. With Code Red, Steven Weber picked up the mantle, and he has done it with this one as well. And so if you're old like me, you might remember him from the TV show Wings. So he is, I can't wait to hear what he's done.
Who was he on Wings?
I don't remember his character name, but he was the main guy on Wings.
What's his name again?
Steven Weber.
Oh, Steven Weber. Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that show. Yeah, it was one of my favorite. I'm also got an aviation background. Got my degree in aerospace from Middle Tennessee. But yeah, love to have you on. Talk more aviation. Talk more of your FBI, and maybe you'll have another book coming out. Go check them out. The Capture comes out September 3rd. Is that right?
Yep. Week from today.
You guys go to his website. Go to his Instagrams. Don's Instagram is it Bentley Don?
Yeah. So my handle for Instagram, Facebook, and X is all the same. It's at Bentley Don B. So there you go.
For our viewing audience, I've got it up there. Go like, follow, subscribe. Let him know that you're a lead head, and you heard him here on the Talking Lead podcast. But those who did submit your questions, I'll be in touch with you about the prizes. So until the next episode, lead heads, as always, keep your loved ones close and your firearms closer, and make sure you go read Don Bentley's new book, Vince Flynn Capture or Kill. We are out.
She said she didn't like that thing.